All right, guys, today we're doing chapter 10 called A Message in Code. The ridge road to Lewiston was busy. At the end of their lane, Bert and Laura had to wait for a wagon load of logs to rumble past. Then, finally, on their way, Sally trotted past the team of oxen that pulled the timber, only to be stopped by four hogs ambling across the road in front of them. Sally fidgeted, for she hated to stop for anything or anybody. The day was bright and crisp. There had been no rain for a week, and dust fanned out from the horses' hooves with every step. When the stagecoach from Rochester dashed by, it left Bert and Laura choking and half blinded. Laura sat up straight on the carriage seat beside Bert. Every time they approached another carriage or a person on foot, she glanced fearfully from beneath her bonnet, afraid of meeting the men who had searched the house that morning. They might stop the carriage and ask more questions. Bert had the same idea, for he warned, "Remember, we're going to town to shop. What are you going to buy?" "Molasses," said Laura promptly, "and material for a new dress, blue silk." As they rode down Center Street past the village green, Laura saw several men lounging on the benches. Sure that they were slave catchers, she kept her face averted. "There's Mrs. Fitch," exclaimed Bert. "Wonder why she's going back so soon." Laura looked up in time to see the neighbor's carriage flash past, headed toward home. Mrs. Fitch, her hands busy with the reins, gave them a brief nod as she went by. Bert chuckled. Maybe Mrs. Todd didn't want to be comforted. I guess she knows what a gossip Mrs. Fitch is. At Fifth Street, they turned left for a short distance and then turned onto Cayuga. Laura recognized the Todd's pleasant rambling house. How many times had she gone there to play? Her own mother had been a close friend of Mrs. Todd, so Laura had gone with her to visit from the time she was a baby. "We have a welcoming committee," muttered Bert. Seated on the carriage block in front of the house was Walt. Already he had noticed Laura. "Don't stop," whispered Laura urgently. "I won't," Bert replied out of the side of his mouth. But Walt would not be ignored. As they drove by, he leaped to his feet and made a low bow. "Greetings, Miss High and Mighty," he shouted. Against her will, Laura looked at him and saw the glint of malice in his dark eyes. He was determined to get even with her for this morning. She told herself she didn't care, but she knew it had been unwise to make him her enemy. At a steady pace, they rounded the next corner, and Bert looked back. He had a clear view, for no other house stood in the way. "There's Joel at the window," he said. As Laura turned, Joel waved, but it was not exactly a wave. It was motioning them away. It was perfectly clear that he didn't want them to stop. "Looks as if Joel is a prisoner in his own house," Bert commented. "Can they do that?" asked Laura. "They can watch the house, and if he puts a foot outside, they can follow him every place he goes. He doesn't want us to stop because the slave hunters will be suspicious of everyone who talks to him." "They already suspect us." "But if we stop, they'd be for sure." Bert pulled gently on the reins, for Center Street lay just ahead. "What do we do now?" "We'll shop," Laura decided. "Stop at the store." When they had purchased the molasses, Bert said, Now, shall we buy your blue silk?" "That was pretend," Laura answered. "I haven't enough money to buy a length of calico, let alone silk." Bert climbed into the carriage and pulled Joel's note from his pocket. "I have a feeling this note is trying to tell us something." He reread a few words, mumbling them to himself. "Maybe it's a code message." "It's nothing of the kind," said Laura. "He's making fun of me, sending me Uncle Tom's Cabin. He knows what I think of that book." "How can you know what you think? How can you know what you think of it? You never read it." "I don't need to read it. I've heard enough about it." Bert said, "I never thought you'd let other people make up your mind for you. You ought to read it yourself and see what you think." He picked up the reins. "We might as well go home. We can't visit Joel, that's for sure." "Wait." Laura put her hand on his sleeve. "Is there anybody else you know who helps fugitives? Anybody who might come after Martin? We have to get him out of the house tonight." "That's right," Bert agreed. "Poor fellow, he'd be so disappointed if we didn't get him to the river by midnight." Poor Martin indeed. It'll be poor of us if Uncle Daniel sees Martin when he comes tomorrow. A stranger sauntered past the carriage and looked curiously at the two occupants. Drive on now, Laura urged Laura. People will wonder what we're talking about. Sally moved briskly into the stream of wagons and carriages going down Center Street toward the river. Bert nodded toward a small shop on their left. I hear Mr. Tryon is a station master on the Underground. He is the tailor shop over there. Then stop, for pity's sake, and ask him to come for Martin. I might be wrong, Bert said cautiously. It's a funny thing you don't even know the other Underground Railroad people in your own town. It's safer not to know too many. I just know the Todds for sure, and also the name of the fellow in Lockport who sends fugitives here, Mr. Lyman Spaulding. He pulled to the side of the street. We'll go talk to Mr. Tryon. I can say we have a friend visiting us who wants to catch a boat and ask him if he can fix his jacket in a hurry. If he's one of us, he'll know what I mean. Laura crossed the wide street beside Bert, holding her skirts clear of the dust. A man in the window of the tailor shop cutting a piece of gray material on a table. Sitting beside him in a straight chair was a dark-bearded man smoking a cigar. Bert would have opened the door, but Laura tugged at his sleeve and walked on. What's the matter? Asked Bert. You wanted to go there. Something's wrong, she said quietly. That man, the one with the beard, doesn't look as if he belongs in there. Bert was impatient. Maybe he's waiting for his pants to be mended. I doubt it. Mr. Tryon is just starting on a new suit. Bert said admiringly. You have your eyes open, don't you? You'd make a first-class agent in the Underground. Don't count on that, Laura replied. I'm not in this because I want to be. When they were back in the carriage, Bert said thoughtfully, Tryon. The tailor's name is Josiah Tryon. So? He again produced the note. Listen, though some may fail, those who try on will succeed. Notice that? Try on sounds like Tryon. Do you suppose Joel was telling us to go to Mr. Tryon? Laura sighed. I never knew you had so much imagination. No, I still say that note was just to tease me. They were nearing the end of Center Street, where the road slopped to the wharf and the American Hotel. Bert turned to the right onto 4th Street. I'm going to drive along the river, he said. I have an idea and want to think. Laura was in no hurry to return home. Riding behind Sally was far pleasanter than sitting at home, jumping at every sound and waiting for the long day to end. At the river road, they turned north, keeping the Niagara on the left. Every now and then Laura could see the blue glint of water through the trees. Here, though wider than at the foot of the falls 7 miles to the south, the river still ran swiftly between lofty banks on its way to Lake Ontario. Laura had a sudden inspiration. Do you think you could get Martin across this suspension bridge? With the slave catchers watching every person who goes across? Bert jeered. Now they were outside the village of Lewiston, and the houses were far apart. There was little traffic. On their left, well back from the road and overlooking the river, Laura noticed a huge stone house topped by a tower. My, who owns that? She asked. That's new, isn't it? Bert glanced at the imposing house with its many chimneys. Judge Horatio Stowe built it not long ago. He was a successful lawyer in Buffalo. Got his start here in town at Mr. Cook's law office, so when he made enough money, he decided to come back here to live. Pa says the judge likes it here. Looking across Judge Stowe's well-cleared lawns, Laura could see the river far below and beyond the steep cliffs of the Canadian shore ablaze with autumn foliage. As soon as they passed Judge Stowe's property, Bert slowed Sally to a walk and kept his eyes on the left. Laura guessed that he was watching for something, but she couldn't imagine what. For a dense woodland came down to the edge of the road, blotting out the view of the river and Canada. Tall pines stood elbow to elbow with red and gold maples and russet oaks, and the undergrowth was so dense she could only see a few feet into the wilderness. When a grass-choked lane came into view, Bert sat up alertly. Laura wondered at his sudden interest. Where does that lead? She asked. There's a big house in there on the riverbank. It's been empty for years. He reined in the horse. Mr. Amos Tryon, that's Josiah's brother, built it, but he never lived in it. He looked up and down the road as if he were thinking of turning around, but just then the wagon with the barrels of apples approached from the north, so Bert again set Sally into motion. Laura looked back at the overgrown drive. A memory teased at the edge of her mind, a memory of something that had happened so long ago that it seemed to have been in another life. I think I know the house, she said slowly. The house with the cellars. That's it. I was in it once, with Joel and Cousin Tessie. Joel dared us to go there with him. Laura was beginning to recall a certain morning when she had been 7 or 8. She and Cousin Tessie, who lived on the river road not far from where they were now, had been playing at Joel's house, and he had dared them to visit the haunted house on the river. We went in through a broken window, she told Bert. The rooms were all cobwebby. Joel took us down cellar, but Tessie got scared. I was scared too, she admitted, but I pretended I wasn't. Joel said there were 4 cellars, one under the other, all the way down to the river. And you know how high the riverbank is here? He wanted to explore all the cellars, but Tessie wouldn't go, so we gave up and went home. Joel and I got spanked for going off without telling anyone, but Tessie didn't get punished. She was visiting me that day and got away without a spanking because she was company. Joel and I didn't think that was fair. The wagon load of apples was almost out of sight behind them and on its way to Lewiston. Do you know what people call that house? Bert asked. Laura shook her head. Tyrion's Folly, Bert chuckled. After Amos Tyrone spent all that money on his house, his wife wouldn't live in it. People say that's the only mistake he ever made in a money way. Laura suddenly had an idea. There was something in Joel's note about folly. She said, "Let me see it." She held out her hand. After all, it is my letter. Bert handed it to her, and she read it aloud. Though some may fail, those who try on and on will succeed. Sometimes folly leads to freedom, and the rabbit escapes from the trap. That's it, Bert, she exclaimed with a quickening of interest. Sometimes folly leads to freedom. Might mean that Tyrion's folly leads to freedom for the runaways. Maybe the slaves hide in the cellars until a boat can pick them up and take them across to Canada. Eureka, sis, I think you're right. Bert beamed at her. Laura reread the last line. I suppose the rabbit is Martin. Now the wagon of apples was out of sight. Again, Bert reined in. What are you doing? Asked Laura, suddenly alarmed. I'm going back and visit Tyrion's Folly, he said. No, you're not. She snatched the reins from his hands and set Sally again on the road north. I am, he said, though he made no effort to reclaim the reins. If that old house is the last stop on the Underground Railroad, I've got to go look at it. Bert Eastman, are you thinking of taking Martin there tonight? Yes, I'm sure you're right. That's where Pa and the Todds take the runaway slaves. Laura felt angry and helpless. I won't let you, she urged Sally to a trot. It's too dangerous. They'll catch you, and then Pa will be arrested and he'll have to pay a big fine. They won't catch me. He put his hands on the reins in front of hers and pulled Sally to a halt. I'll get out, Laura threatened. Get out then. Laura glared at him. I'll go to the sheriff. Bert gazed up at her scornfully. And how would that help Pa? A clattered sound on the road behind them. Laura looked over her shoulder and saw a man riding a large, piebald horse, coming after them full tilt. Bert sighed and again moved Sally ahead. Quickly the horse came abreast of their carriage, and a moment later the rider swerved directly in front of them and halted. Sally was so frightened that she reared up on her hind legs, and the rider leaped down from his horse. Laura recognized the insolent young slave catcher named Walt. All right, that was the end of chapter 10. All right, guys, don't forget to do your Google form. Have a good day.